Chapter 20 Struggle for Freedom Part 1. Let's learn. Origin of Nationalism, Rise of Nationalism in India, the Vernacular Press Act and Arms Act, Ilbert Bill Agitation, Emergence of Indian National Congress, Partition of Bengal, the Boycott and Swadeshi movements, the rise of radical nationalists, formation of Muslim League, Morley Minto reforms, the national movement, Ghadar Party. In the previous chapter, you have been reading about the history of our civilization starting from the prehistoric age till the modern period. You have travelled down to this lesson on India's freedom movement. Don't you think it was an interesting journey? You read how as society grew, some people became more powerful than the others. You also read how money and land became a source of greed for powerful nations. This led to protest and resistance against states and nations that tried to control the others by exploiting their natural and human resources and by ruling over them ruthlessly. One of these states happened to be our own country, India. You will read about India's long struggle for freedom in this lesson. Origin of Nationalism. The rise of nationalism is reflected in the spirit of Renaissance in Europe, when freedom from religious restrictions led to the enhancement of national identity. This expression of nationalism was further enhanced by the French Revolution. The political changes resulted in the passing of sovereignty from the hands of an absolute monarch to the French citizens who had the power to constitute the nation and shape its destiny. The watchwords of the French Revolution, liberty, equality and fraternity, inspired the whole world. Many other revolutions like the American Revolution, the Russian Revolution, etc. also strengthened the idea of nationalism. In this lesson, you will read about the rise of nationalism in India, which emerged in the 19th century after the revolt of 1857. Rise of nationalism in India. For India, the making of national identity was a long process. It was only in the 19th century that the concept of a national identity and national consciousness emerged. The social, economic and political factors had inspired people to define and acquire their national identity. People began discovering their unity in the process of their struggle against colonialism. The sense of being oppressed under colonial rule provided a shared bond that tied different groups together. Each class and group felt the effects of colonialism differently. Their experiences were varied, and their notions of freedom were not always the same. The farmers were forced to pay very high taxes. The artisans and craftspeople were unemployed due to the huge influx of cheap, machine-made British goods. The industrial workers received very low wages. Moreover, India was made to pay for the maintenance of the British army, as also the wars that Britain fought outside India. The steady and relentless drain of wealth from India resulted in widespread and terrible poverty in the country, especially in rural India. To add insult to injury, the British treated the Indians as an inferior race, not allowing them entry into certain areas like parks, hospitals, clubs, restaurants, and even train compartments, as these were reserved exclusively for the British. Several other causes also contributed towards the rise and growth of nationalism. One set of laws of British government across several regions led to political and administrative unity. Economy in India was interlinked after the establishment of modern industries, and people from across the country worked in these industries. Working, living and travelling together, people thought less about caste and regional differences, and feelings of united cause and solidarity developed. The railways, telegraph and postal system improved communication and enabled people to connect with one another, form groups and exchange thoughts and ideas. All this created a sense of oneness among Indian masses whose anti-British feelings contributed to the rise of nationalism. This strengthened the concept of citizenship and one nation among Indians. The intellectual and spiritual side of nationalism was voiced by persons like Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, Swami Dayanand Saraswati, and Aurobindo Ghosh. Bankim Chandra's hymn to the motherland Vande Mataram became the rallying cry of patriotic nationalists. It inspired generations to supreme self-sacrifice. Simultaneously, it created a fear in the minds of the British. The impact was so strong that the British had to ban the song. Similarly, Swami Vivekananda's message to the people, "Arise, awake, and stop not till the goal is reached," appealed to the Indians. It acted as a potent force in the awakening and consolidation of Indian nationalism. Info Hive. In Shimla, British India's summer capital, Indians were not allowed to walk on the Mall Road. Brain tickler. When did America get independence? Effect of modern education. Contrary to what the British had expected, the modern British systems of education only contributed to the rise of nationalism. The colonial rulers had expected that the Indians that they had prepared to serve them as low-placed civil servants, as also such Indians who were exposed to Western ideas and thought, would become ardent supporters of the colonial rule and be loyal to them. This, in fact, never happened. Instead, exposure to Western ideas made people more aware of their rights. The ideals of freedom and equality, as propounded by the American and French revolutions, impressed the educated Indians greatly, and they began to abhor the British for their self-serving motives in effecting the oppressive subjugation of India and its people. This contributed to rise of nationalist sentiment, as now easier communication could now occur between peoples of diverse regions through a common language, English. The Vernacular Press Act and Arms Act of 1878. Do you remember reading about the establishment of printing press and how it helped in wide circulation of ideas like liberty, equality and fraternity? The Vernacular Press Act and Arms Act of 1878. Do you remember reading about the establishment of printing press and how it helped in wide circulation of ideas like liberty, equality and fraternity? In 1878, the Vernacular Press Act was passed by Lord Lytton. This act empowered a magistrate to secure an undertaking from the editor, publisher and printer of a vernacular newspaper that nothing would be published against the English government. The equipment of the press could be seized if the offence was committed. This act crushed the freedom of the Indian press. This created adverse public opinion against the British government. In the same year, the Arms Act was passed. This act prevented the Indians from keeping arms without appropriate license. Its violation would be a criminal offence. The Europeans and the Anglo-Indians were exempted from the operation of these legislations. This further inflamed anti-British feelings among Indians. Ilbert Bill agitation of 1883. Lord Ripon wanted to remove two kinds of laws that had been prevalent in India. According to the system of law, a European could be tried only by a European judge or a European magistrate. The disqualification for Indian judges was unjust, and it was sought to cast a needless discredit and dishonour upon the Indian-born members of the judiciary. C.P. Ilbert, law member of the Viceroy's Council, introduced a bill in 1884 to abolish this discrimination in judiciary. But Europeans opposed this bill strongly. They even raised a fund of 1,50,000 rupees and established an organization called the Defence Association. They also suggested that it was better to end the English rule in India than to allow the English to be subjected to Indian judges and magistrates. The press in England joined the issue. Hence, Ripon amended the bill to satisfy the English in India and England. The Ilbert Bill controversy helped the cause of Indian nationalism. All these factors helped in the spread of nationalism. Among the people of India, around this time many organizations were being formed which raised their voices against the British rule. Some of these organizations were very active, such as British Indian Association, formed by Surendranath Banerjee in 1851, Bengal Indian Association, Bombay Presidency Association, Pune Public Meeting, Madras Mahajan Sabha, etc. However, it was felt that if these regional organizations could work jointly, it would help the Indian masses to raise their voices unitedly against the British rule. This led to the formation of Indian National Congress in the year 1885. Emergence of Indian National Congress. The Indian National Congress was founded by Alan Octavian Hume in 1885. Hume was a retired civil service officer. He saw a growing political consciousness among the Indians and wanted to give it a safe constitutional outlet so that their resentment would not develop into popular agitation against the British rule in India. He was supported in this scheme by the Viceroy, Lord Dufferin, and by a group of eminent Indians. Vyomesh Chandra Banerjee of Calcutta was elected as the first president. The Indian National Congress represented an urge of the politically conscious Indians to set up a national organization to work for their betterment. Its leaders had complete faith in the British government and in its sense of justice. They believed that if they would place their grievances before the government reasonably, the British would certainly try to readdress them. Among the liberal leaders, the most prominent were Feroz Shah Mehta, Vyomesh Chandra Banerjee, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, Dada Bhai Naroji, Dinshaw Vacha, Badruddin Tayyabji, etc. From 1885 to 1905, the Indian National Congress had a very narrow social base. Its influence was confined to the urban educated Indians. The early aims of this organization were limited only to bring together all leaders from across the country to form a consensus on problems related to India and to communicate with the British government on behalf of the Indian people and voice their grievances. It was rightly called the era of the moderates. You will soon find out why. Info Hive. Aga Khan Palace, where Mahatma Gandhi was imprisoned and where Kasturba Gandhi breathed her last, is located in Pune. Initial stages of Indian National Congress. The Congress placed its demands before the government, always in the form of petitions, and worked within the framework of law. During its first 20 years, the Congress made moderate demands through petitions. It was for this reason that the early Congress leaders were referred to as moderates. They asked for representative legislatures, Indianization of services, reduction of military expenditure, education, employment and holding of the ICS Indian Civil Services examination in India, decrease in the burden of the cultivators, defense of civil rights, reduction in land revenue and salt duty, policies to help in the growth of Indian industries and handicrafts. British behavior towards the Congress. Unfortunately, efforts of Congress leaders did not bring many changes in the policies and administration of the British in India. In the beginning, the British had a favourable attitude towards the Congress, but by 1887, this attitude began to change. They did not fulfill the demands of the moderates. The only achievement of the Congress was the enactment of the Indian Councils Act of 1892 that enlarged the legislature by adding a few non-official members and passing off a resolution for holding Indian Civil Services examination simultaneously in London and in India. Many leaders gradually lost faith in constitutional process. Even though the Congress failed to achieve its goal, it succeeded in creating national awakening and instilling in the minds of the Indian people a sense of belonging to one nation. The most significant achievement was the foundation of a strong national movement. The British, who were earlier supporting the moderates, soon realized that the movement could turn into a national force that would drive them out of the country. This totally changed their attitude. They passed strict laws to control education and curb the press. Minor concessions were given so as to win over some Congress leaders. The British Viceroy Lord Curzon passed an act in 1898, making it an offence to provoke people against the British rulers. He passed the Indian Universities Act in 1904, imposing stiff control over Indian universities. Curzon was out to suppress the rising nationalism in India. This was evident from what he did in 1905, about which you will read in the next section. Brain tickler. Why did Lord Curzon partition Bengal and not Punjab? Partition of Bengal in 1905. Curzon announced the partition of Bengal. The reason for partition was given as an attempt to improve administration. But the real aim was to divide and rule. The partition was done in order to create a separate state for Muslims and to introduce the poison of communalism in the country. However, the Indians viewed the partition as an attempt by the British to disrupt the growing national movement in Bengal and divide the Hindus and Muslims of the region. Widespread agitation ensued in the streets and in the press. People in different parts of India opposed the partition of Bengal all over the country. This opposition was carried on by organizing meetings, processions, and demonstrations, etc. Hindus and Muslims tied Rakhi on each other's hands to show their unity and their protest. The boycott and Swadeshi movements. The use of Swadeshi, made in our own country by our own people, goods, business, national education, and Indian languages were encouraged. The Swadeshi and boycott movement was started on 7 August 1905. It was Bal Gangadhar Tilak who realized the importance of boycott as a weapon that could be used to paralyze the whole British administrative machinery in India. The boycott and Swadeshi movements were instrumental in the establishment of Swadeshi enterprises, textile mills, banks, hosiery, tanneries, chemical works, and insurance companies. Swadeshi stores were opened. Volunteers supplied goods at the doorstep of every household. The movement spread to all the classes and groups of people. The people openly challenged the British by lighting bonfires of British goods. This made the British reverse the partition of Bengal and unite it in 1911. During this time, the role of radical nationalists in the Indian National Congress, who were called the Garam Dal, came to be appreciated. They tried to involve people from all classes and groups, including peasants, workers, students, as well as women. They succeeded in uniting the Indian people against the common enemy, the British. The young people were roused to highest level of patriotism and zeal to free their country. They helped in making people self-confident and self-reliant. They also revived the Indian cottage industry. The rise of radical nationalists. Here is a picture of Lal Bal Pal, the famous radical leaders. The mild policies of the moderates in the Congress led to the rise of passionate radical nationalists who came to be called the Garam Dal. Thus the first phase of the nationalist movement came to an end with government reaction against the Congress on the one hand and a split in the Congress in 1907 on the other. That's why the period after 1905 till 1918 can be referred to as the era of passionate nationalists or Garam Dal. Lala Lajpat Rai, Bal Gangadhar Tilak and Bipin Chandra Pal, Lal Bal Pal were important leaders of this radical group. According to them, the moderates had failed to define India's political goals, and the methods adopted by them were mild and ineffective. Besides, the moderates remained confined to the upper class and failed to enlist mass support as a basis for negotiating with the British. This group, instead of making petitions to the government, believed in organizing mass protests, criticizing government policies, boycotting foreign goods and promoting use of Swadeshi, homemade goods. They did not believe in depending on the mercy of the British, but believed that freedom was their right. Bal Gangadhar Tilak gave a slogan, "Swaraj is my birthright, and I shall have it." Formation of the Muslim League of 1906. As the radical movement grew stronger, the British began to look for ways and means to break the unity among Indians. They tried to do this through the partition of Bengal and by sowing the seed of communalism among Indian people. They motivated Muslims to form a permanent political association of their own. In December 1906, during the Mohammedan Educational Conference in Dhaka, Nawab Salim Ullah Khan raised the idea of establishing a central Mohammedan association to take care of Muslim interests. Accordingly, on 30th December 1906, the All India Muslim League was founded. Another prominent person, Aga Khan, was chosen as its president. The main objective of the League was to protect and advance the rights of Muslims in India and represent their needs to the government. By encouraging their needs to the government, the issue of separate electorates, the government sowed the seed of communalism and separatism among Indians. The formation of Muslim League is considered to be the first fruit of British master strategy of divide and rule. Muhammad Ali Jinnah later joined the League. Brain tickler. When was the Government of India Act passed in India? Surat Split of 1907. The movement against the partition of Bengal had temporarily united the moderates and the radicals. In 1907, there was a split in the Congress which parted the moderates and the radicals. The moderates had decided to control the Congress and the radicals decided to function from outside. These two groups were reunited in the Congress session at Lucknow in 1916. Morley-Minto Reforms, 1909. The Council Act of 1909, also known as Morley-Minto Reforms, was an extension of the 1892 reforms named after the then Secretary of State, Lord Morley, and the then Viceroy, Lord Minto. Important provisions of the Act were: it increased the members of Legislative Assembly from 16 to 60. A few non-elected members were also added. The British made another calculated move to sow the seed of communalism in Indian politics by introducing separate electorates for the Muslims. This meant that from the constituencies dominated by Muslims, only Muslim candidates could be elected. Hindus could only vote for Hindus and Muslims could only vote for Muslims. Many leaders protested against this communal electorate policy of the British. The National Movement. The First World War started in the year 1914. This war was fought among the nations of Europe to get colonial monopoly. During wartime, the British government made an appeal to the Indian leaders to join hands with them in their time of crisis. Indian leaders agreed, but they put their own terms and conditions, that is, after the war was over, the British government would give constitutional, legislative and administrative powers to Indian people. Unfortunately, the steps taken by the British government during the World War I created unrest among the Indian people. This was because of the British government that had taken a huge loan during wartime, which they had to repay. They increased rent from the land, that is the Lagan. They forcefully recruited Indians in the British Army. They increased the price of necessary goods and imposed taxes on personal and professional income. As a result, they had to face protest from the Indian society. Farmers and workers of Champaran, Bardoli, Kheda and Ahmedabad actively protested against the exploitative policies of British government. Lakhs of students left schools and colleges. Hundreds of lawyers gave up their practice. Women also significantly contributed in this movement, and their participation became wider with the emergence of Gandhi. The boycott of foreign cloth became a mass movement, with thousands of bonfires of foreign cloth lighting the Indian sky. During the first couple of decades in the 20th century, a number of revolutionary movements grew in Bengal, Punjab and Maharashtra. Secret societies were set up to train young men to carry out such activities that would weaken the British rule. Some of these societies were the Abhinav Bharat Society in Maharashtra and the Anushilan Samiti in Bengal. These radicals began assassinating British officials. The Chapekar brothers killed two unpopular British officials in Maharashtra. In 1908, Khudiram Bose and Prafulla Chaki threw a bomb at Kingsford, the unpopular district judge. In 1912, an attempt was made on the life of Viceroy Lord Hardinge. Ghadar Party. Some revolutionaries migrated to Europe and the USA and were active there. They were Madam Bhikhaji Kama, Lala Hardayal, Ras Bihari Bose, Shyamji Krishna Verma, Sohan Singh Bakhna, V.D. Savarkar, Muhammad Barkhutullah, and Obidullah Sindhi. They together formed the Ghadar Party to raise an armed rebellion. They sent a large number of revolutionaries to organize an uprising in India in 1915. But the British came to know of the plan. Consequently, many revolutionaries were imprisoned. Khudiram Bose was hanged. Some were sentenced to life imprisonment. The revolutionaries of this period inspired many people to join the nationalist movement and become heroes. Elsewhere in the world, struggle for independence in Vietnam. The Vietnam War had its roots in the country's colonial history. In the 19th century, France gradually conquered Vietnam. It eventually ruled Vietnam as part of French Indochina, which also included Cambodia and Laos. French rule continued until World War II, when Japan occupied Vietnam. In 1943, a Vietnamese nationalist group known as the Viet Minh began fighting the Japanese for Vietnam's freedom. The group was led by the communist revolutionary Ho Chi Minh, a man who was to play a major role in Vietnamese history. Ho's Viet Minh liberated much of northern Vietnam from Japanese control. After Japan lost World War II, Ho declared Vietnam's independence on September 2, 1945. France, however, believed that Indochina was still rightfully its colony and was determined to retake control. By the end of the year, the French had seized southern Vietnam, but the communist-led Viet Minh retained control of the north. From 1946 to 1954, the Viet Minh fought France in what became known as the First Indochina War. The United States, which was opposed to the spread of communism, helped fund and equip the French. Ho built support among the Vietnamese people and waged an increasingly successful guerrilla war from bases in the countryside. After suffering a major defeat in 1954, France decided to pull out of Vietnam. Recap: Renaissance, the First Revolution, American Revolution, Russian Revolution had promoted the idea of nationalism in the world. Anti-colonial movement led to the rise of nationalism in India in the late 19th century. The contemporary social and religious reform movements also contributed to the rise of feelings of nationalism. Indian National Congress was founded in 1885 only to communicate with British government on behalf of Indian people and voice their grievances. In 1905, Lord Curzon announced the partition of Bengal. Indians viewed the partition as an attempt by the British to disrupt the growing nationalist movement in Bengal and divide the Hindus and Muslims of the region. In 1906, Muslim League was formed in Dhaka with the objective to protect and advance the rights of Muslims in India and represent their needs to the government. Difference in ideas led to split in Congress in 1907. Two groups, that is moderates Naram Dal and radicals Garam Dal, were formed. In the First World War, Indian leaders agreed to help the British government on the condition that the latter would give constitutional powers to Indians after the war.